Meg has a daring plan to escape on the flying contraptions. Problem is, Prince Martin is afraid of heights. Will they escape? Will Martin find the courage? Let's read and see. Chapter 13, The Great Escape. Ted the elf got a rope and a harness and hooks. From his pack and his friends all exchanged nervous looks. Then the elf slung the rope and a hook firmly struck to the terrace below by a struck of good luck. Ted connected the harness and lowered each friend to the terrace until he himself could descend. And no one needed fear that this wood elf would fall. Ted rappelled his way down with no trouble at all. Now they stood on that terrace 2 stories below, where the girl had been kept, and soon Northmen would go. Meg then showed them the ladder that she'd seen from her cell. It was 30 feet long and went up to a bell that rang 12 times a day and would ring next at noon. Meg looked at the sun and knew it wouldn't ring soon. And the guard in the meantime was taking a nap. So they borrowed his ladder to cross that great gap. Like a walkway, they laid it across the 2 decks. Now they knew if they fell, they would all break their necks. Way up high off the ground, their capes snapped in the wind. This was welcome because their escape would depend on the winds being strong and the winds being steady. Meg said, "Now for the hard part. I wish I felt ready." Ted said, "I'll cross first. It looks fairly secure. When I reach the far side, I will stop to ensure that the ladder won't slip, reposition, or slide. I will then get 3 flyers all ready to glide. There's a harness for Ray and another for John, who both need a hand, and we will strap them on. John the Wolf and Sir Ray couldn't fly by themselves. They would glide with their friends using straps made by elves." Ted the elf crossed that walkway according to plan. He was used to great heights and was more nimble than his companions because of his time in the trees. Ted could work off the ground with the greatest of ease. He secured the far end so the thing wouldn't slip. Then his friends began making the very same trip. John was next to cross over that frightening gap. Ted tied John to his flyer with the harness and strap. Now to show all his friends that the deed could be done, the bold tree tender launched and they sailed off in the sun. Now Meg knew how to fly, having closely watched Ted. "Ray, will you ride with me?" the brave 9-year-old said. Only then did Sir Ray say, "But where is the prince?" They had not thought of Martin for 5 minutes since they had focused on crossing that perilous pass. Now they turned around quickly, both Ray and the lass. Over there was Prince Martin, scared out of his wits, afraid he would fall and then break into bits. He had not crossed that bridge, having frozen with fright. He now stared at the ground from that horrible height. The scenes flashed into his mind from that frightening day on a tall mountain cliff, what had happened to Ray. He remembered the horror and the terror he felt. He was paralyzed now, felt his courage just melt. Ray and Meg both called out, "You can do it, please try." But all he could do was just stand there and cry, for the prince had been struck by a panic attack. Ray said, "Meg, go ahead. I have to go back." The knight called to Prince Martin, "I'm coming, my friend." On that boldest of nights, the boy's life would depend. Ray went back to the ladder. He made it halfway, and that's when an awful thing happened to Ray. Something struck his hind legs, and it caused him to slip, but somehow that canine still managed to grip the side rail of the ladder. He hung in the air. The 2 children looked on in dismay and despair. It was clear to this kid's his hind legs had been caught by a bola, now tied in a terrible knot. They looked up at the terrace and focused their eyes. They saw Fellman, of course, which was not a surprise. and beside him was standing that warlord most wild. Those two Northmen looked down, and they wickedly smiled. Fellman heckled Prince Martin to try to destroy any grit that was left in that 10-year-old boy. But the prince now ignored him and looked at his friend. Martin thought to himself, this cannot be the end. He remembered the time when Sir Ray he had met, and together faced down the most terrible threat. And when Ray couldn't walk, Martin bore his friend's weight. They had somehow survived, though the danger was great. Now he gritted his teeth and he lifted his chin. He had done this before. He would do it again. The boy took his first step on that bridge in the sky. Martin never looked down. He just met his friend's eye. As he stepped rung to rung, heading straight to Sir Ray, he thought, someday we'll die, but it won't be today. Meanwhile, slaver and warlord, blue-faced and most wild, were repelling the wall. They were awfully riled. When he got to Sir Ray, Martin never once thought of himself as he focused and started to squat. Then he struggled and strained, and he lifted Sir Ray. For a horrible moment, they started to sway, but the boy kept his balance and bore his friend's weight. With Sir Ray on his shoulders, the prince headed straight to the pad, where they parked those contraptions that fly. They could see John and Ted floating high in the sky. Meg had stayed and made ready a harness for Ray. She would ride right beside them that cold northern day. Chapter 14, Contraptions That Fly. Martin helped Meg to harness the knot-ridden Ray to the frame of her flyer. She'd launch right away. Now the slaver and warlord were awfully near. They would soon be upon them. The children could hear that the latter now groaned from the weight of each brute. They were bridging the gap in determined pursuit. They could hear the bells ringing now. Guards were aware that the girl had escaped in a desperate dare. A great clatter arose. Arrows struck on the pad. Archers aimed at Sir Ray, and the lass and the lad, who unslung his new shield and held it up high. He protected his friends as Meg readied to fly. Arrows hit Martin's shield from those archers above. "We're ready," yelled Meg. "Martin, give us a shove." The boy pushed the girl's glider. It launched in the air. Then Prince Martin looked back and could see that the pair of big Northernmen had crossed. They now stood on the pad. They were glaring at Martin. Those Northmen were mad. And the warlord yelled out in a black fit of rage, "Guards, release all the battle cats. Open the cage." There were 2 flyers left, and the boy surely knew that to cripple one flyer was what he must do. So he slashed at one wing with his sharp little sword. Then he raced to the other. The boy climbed aboard. Through a shower of arrows, the kid launched his craft, and he earnestly hoped for a strong upward draft. But the warlord that instant caught up, and he lunged, and he grabbed the lad's glider, and downward they plunged. Martin hurtled straight down to the concrete below with a 280-pound warlord in tow. His craft dropped like a stone, and the ground rose up fast. Of the tales of Prince Martin, would this be the last? But the prince pulled a lever that triggered the springs that adjusted the vents on the hang glider's wings. This arrested the nosedive and righted their course. Now they glided away from that enemy force. Still the weight of the warlord impeded their flight. And to make matters worse, the man started to bite. Flying low, Martin's craft glided over the lake. The lad feared that its frame was beginning to break, and the weight of the warlord would crumple its wings. But what happened next was the strangest of things. The cold water exploded, and up from the deep rose a huge golden fish with a 60-foot leap. Drops of water like diamonds rained down from this carp, and its great teeth were like daggers, incredibly sharp. It engulfed the big warlord. He met a bad end. But the boy surged aloft, being borne by the wind. Martin stared at the ripples with horror and awe, thinking, that's what the sign meant by what we saw. This prince still had a problem, though. Fellman now flew in those last of flyers and sailed into view. But that flyer flew low from the gash Martin made when he'd hacked at its wings with his sharp little blade. And the wound to that wing had continued to rip during flight till it flapped in a long, ragged strip. Fellman's glider flew low and was starting to sink. Would the slaver crash land on that deep icy brink? Then another explosion burst forth from the lake. Fellman tilted and jerked the emergency brake. A goldfish snapped its jaws, but it bit at thin air. That carp missed Fellman's feet by the width of a hair. Oh, but now Fellman's flyer was out of control, and it crashed by the bank in a gravelly shoal. Then a strong gust of wind blew the young fellow toward his 4 hovering friends, and the 5 of them soared. Oh, but Fellman survived. He glared up at the boy. In a low voice he said, "Time to search and destroy." What a terrible ending for the big warlord. To be eaten by a giant goldfish. Yeah. But Martin did great, didn't he? He was really afraid, but he found courage. And how did he find courage? When he stopped thinking about himself and he started thinking about his friend that needed him so desperately. Now, the Bible teaches us that there is no greater love. The greatest display of love is when you're willing to lay down your life for your friends. And we saw this demonstrated in Jesus, who laid down his life, who gave his life to pay the penalty for our sins so that we could become children of God. And now as children of God, we want to love like Jesus did. And so how do we do that? We don't lay down our lives for other people very often, but here's something we can do. We can put aside our desires for the needs and desires of others. Instead of trying to make yourself happy, you try to think of a way that you can make other people happy, other people that you love. And so maybe this week you could try to think of a way, or even today, think of a way that instead of just thinking about yourself and making yourself happy, you could make someone else happy instead. We'll see you next time.